I lift my hand just now? What has to happen internally throughout my body to allow that to happen? How can I feel the pressure when I place it back on the table? There's so much that goes on inside of our body through a process known as neurotransmission. It is the biological basis of what we do, what we say, and how we think. So today we're going to start by taking a look at the neuron to see how these cells communicate with each other and make up all of the ways that we think, the ways that we act, the ways that we feel, the ways that we behave. There are so many different components when it comes to neurons and neurotransmission, from the parts of the neuron and the little chemical messengers that are sent throughout the brain and throughout the body, the communication system with our hormones and our endocrine system, and the effect that different types of drugs can play on these neurotransmitters. So we're going to take a look today at the beginning of this process through the nervous system, because the nervous system is where all of these neurons and neurotransmitters are going to communicate. The nervous system as a whole makes up our entire body. It is the communication system, the highway, so to speak, where information travels back and forth throughout our body to our glands, to our muscles, to our brain, to all different areas that make up the things that we think, do, and feel. Within the nervous system is the central nervous system, and that is simply the brain and the spinal cord. It is the main component of the nervous system where everything else is going to branch out from there. The rest of the nervous system is known as the peripheral nervous system, which is going to connect the rest of our body essentially to the central nervous system. Within the peripheral nervous system, we have two more branches. The first one is referred to as the autonomic nervous system, which is what controls all of our bodily functions. Think like heart rate, breathing, the things that take place automatically in our body. So an easy way to remember autonomic is to think automatic. And then we break the autonomic down into two more categories of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So inside of our autonomic nervous system of heart rate, breathing, digestion, those things that we don't have conscious control over, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are responsible for speeding up and slowing down those different bodily processes. So when you are experiencing an emergency, for example, the sympathetic nervous system is going to kick into gear to allow the body to prepare for fight or flight. Your heart rate will increase, your breathing will increase, you might start to perspire, your body is mobilizing as it's preparing to run away or defend yourself from attack. After that emergency is over, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick into gear to slow everything back down, your heart rate, your breathing, and so on. The only body process that works in opposite directions is going to be digestion, because you don't need to be digesting your food when you're running away from an attack. However, once that emergency is over, your digestion will speed back up to resume its function like normal. And then finally, on the other side of the autonomic nervous system, we have the somatic nervous system. And the somatic is going to be all of our voluntary muscle movements, the things that we choose to do. It's also called the skeletal nervous system. So imagine a skeleton moving its arms around, that would be the somatic nervous system at play. Now all of these processes, your heart rate, your breathing, you're moving your hands and your arms, that is happening as a result of the messengers in the nervous system, which are our neurons. Neurons are the actual cells that communicate back and forth throughout our nervous system in our body. They're specialized cells that are responsible for the whole communication system, and they exist within both our brain and the rest of our body. There's also another type of cell in our brain that is known as glial cells, or neuroglia, and these are kind of the support cells in our nervous system. They help to insulate the brain and insulate the neurons. They help to repair and maintain the brain and protect it from harm. And then there are three types of neurons that exist called sensory, motor, and inner neurons. Sensory neurons are going to be the ones to take information up from our muscles and glands and take that into the brain. Think of it as our sense of touch. If I put my hand on a hot stove, sensory neurons are going to send that information to the brain to tell me that I am hurting. Motor neurons are going to go from the brain to the rest of the body. So think about how a motor moves. It's what allows us to move our hands, our arms, and our legs. So when I have that hand on a hot stove, the motor neurons are used to pull my hand away. Interneurons are that third type of neuron that exist in the brain and the spinal cord. They're going to send information back and forth to different parts of the brain. So as that information from the sensory neurons come in about my hand on a hot stove, it will send it to the right areas of the brain to perceive that pain and then to tell the brain to send messages back out to the motor neurons to pull the hand away. And this can actually happen in two places. Not only does it happen in the brain, but with reflexes, your spinal cord can actually control some of that movement as well. The interneurons in your spinal cord can provide that reflex arc that allows you to pull your hand away quickly before your brain has even had an opportunity to perceive that pain that has just occurred. It's also referred to as the knee-jerk response. Now, the way these neurons communicate with each other is through a process called neural transmission. And that is just how information is sent from one neuron to the next in order to send the different messages throughout the brain and the body. The messages that are sent through a process called an action potential. It's the electrical activity that actually goes down the neuron to send the message from one neuron to the next, pushing the chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters from one neuron to the next until it gets to wherever it is it needs to go. This process is triggered by what's called a depolarization. It's the basis for neural communication. So when a message is received in a neuron, a cell goes through this depolarization, making it less negative than it was before. And that is going to open up the channels that are going to allow for this electrical activity of an action potential to take place. When we are going through depolarization, there's a threshold that needs to be met. When that threshold is met, that is when that action potential can fire. If it has not reached that threshold, the neuron will not fire. It's called an all or none response as a result, because that threshold is the only thing that is going to cause a neuron to fire. It could depolarize, but just not quite to that point, and so the cell will not do anything. But once it hits that point, no matter how strong the signal is, it will fire at the same rate every time. Once a neuron has sent a message and it's gone through this action potential where it has fired off a message and sent it to the next neuron, that cell has to go through what's known as a refractory period. It has to go back to its polarized state before another message can fire again. During the refractory period, the neuron is going to pump out all of the previous ions to return back to its resting state. As it releases those neurotransmitters that are then going to be sent on to the next neuron, some of them are going to be reabsorbed so they can be used again. And that process is called reuptake. It helps to remove those neurotransmitters from the gaps between the neurons, and it allows that message to be sent again if need be. Once that whole process is done and the neuron returns to its resting potential or its resting state, then another message can be received and sent through that action potential. Now, sometimes something goes wrong in this neurotransmission process, and different neurological diseases can actually occur as a result. Different neurological disorders like multiple sclerosis, for example, that is characterized by damage to the myelin sheath, that protective coating around neurons that allows it to fire and fire quickly, can lead to a whole host of symptoms that we associate with MS. And myasthenia gravis is another neurological disorder that specifically targets the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. You might be wondering, what is acetylcholine and what does it do? There are lots of different neurotransmitters, the actual messages that are being sent from one neuron to the next. These different neurotransmitters do a wide variety of functions, and there are different disorders that are associated with their malfunction. For example, acetylcholine, or ACH, is primarily responsible for muscle movement and memory. And so when there's not enough ACH, there are memory problems that are going to occur. The common disorder that we associate with ACH is Alzheimer's. Dopamine is a pleasure neurotransmitter. It's what's released when you do something that is enjoyable. Dopamine actually has two disorders associated with it. Too much dopamine in the brain can actually be a cause of schizophrenia. Too little is what causes the neurological disorder of Parkinson's. Serotonin is our happiness neurotransmitter. So naturally, when we don't have enough serotonin in our brain, that can cause the opposite of happiness, which of course is depression. Norepinephrine is the adrenaline of the brain. It's actually sometimes referred to as noradrenaline. It's what arouses the brain and mobilizes it in the case of emergencies. GABA is our main inhibitory neurotransmitter. It does the opposite. It slows the body processes down. If your brain doesn't produce enough GABA, that inhibitory process can't take place. Things like heart rate and breathing don't slow down, and so the associated disorder is anxiety. Glutamate is responsible for a wide variety of functions. It is actually our main excitatory neurotransmitter, which means we have a lot of it in the brain. It's responsible for things like plasticity, learning, and memory. Endorphins are our body's natural painkillers. And the opposite is substance P. It's what sends pain messages throughout our brain, letting us know when we have harmed ourselves. These different neurotransmitters are sent throughout our brain and throughout our body through the nervous system. But we also have another messenger system, which is called the endocrine system. And this is what sends messages through our bloodstream. And these messengers are known as hormones. There are a variety of different hormones that are responsible for different bodily functions and behaviors. Some of them are similar to neurotransmitters, while others are vastly different. Adrenaline, or epinephrine, is very similar to the neurotransmitter of norepinephrine, but this, of course, is going to be the hormonal side. In an emergency, both will be activated, norepinephrine in the brain and adrenaline throughout the body. Leptin is very different. Leptin is a hunger hormone, and when we don't have enough leptin in our system, we're going to feel hunger. When we have enough leptin in our system, we feel full. Opposite to that is ghrelin. When you have a lot of ghrelin in your system, you are going to feel hungry. I like to think that ghrelin is what makes your stomach growl. It stimulates hunger and it regulates your appetite. Melatonin is a sleep hormone. It's produced by the pineal gland and helps regulate that sleep-wake cycle. So melatonin is what's responsible for helping you feel tired at night. And oxytocin is a hormone and a neurotransmitter that's responsible for trust, bonding, and maternal behavior. It's sometimes called the love or the cuddle hormone as a result. So together, hormones and neurotransmitters, they help our bodies to experience all of the different sensations and feelings that take place in our bodies. But sometimes outside chemicals can impact the way that we feel and the way that we behave. And so our last topic for today is the substances and their impact on neurotransmitters. Because there are different types of drugs, both legal and illegal, that are going to have an effect on our brain's functioning. They can affect mood, perception, cognition, and consciousness. And they fall into three major categories: agonists, antagonists, and reuptake inhibitors. Agonists are going to be drugs that mimic the effects of a neurotransmitter, and so they enhance the feeling that that neurotransmitter usually does. Antagonists are going to block the effects of a neurotransmitter, so they are going to prevent a neurotransmitter from doing their job or for us to feel the effects of it. And reuptake inhibitors are drugs that are going to prevent the reabsorption of neurotransmitters, so it increases the amount in the synapse. Much like an agonist, you're likely going to then feel an increase in the effects of that neurotransmitter. When it comes to drugs that can affect these neurotransmitters, they fall into four major categories. We have stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, and opioids. Stimulants are going to be those psychoactive drugs that are going to increase alertness, attention, and energy. Examples of that include things like caffeine, cocaine, and amphetamines. Caffeine, of course, being a legal stimulant, like coffee, tea, or other beverages, they are going to increase our alertness and reduce our fatigue. Cocaine, on the other hand, is an illegal form of a stimulant that increases dopamine levels in the brain, which is what makes it highly addictive. You get these very brief feelings of euphoria, followed by a pretty severe crash. Depressants are the psychoactive drugs that are going to slow down brain function. They induce relaxation, sedation, and sometimes even reducing anxiety. For example, alcohol is a depressant that affects the central nervous system. It's going to do things like slow down our coordination, judgment, and cognitive functions. It's referred to as a depressant in all doses. Hallucinogens are going to be psychoactive drugs that distort perception. They can induce hallucinations and other sensory experiences. These include things like LSD and THC. In marijuana, the ingredient that is known as a hallucinogen is called THC. This has those hallucinogenic effects of altering mood, perception, and cognition. And then finally, there are opioids. Opioids are psychoactive drugs that act as an opioid receptor. Legally, these could be things like morphine and oxycodone that are used as painkillers. And in illegal substances, that could be something like heroin. Heroin is an illegal opioid drug that is synthesized from morphine. It is highly addictive and produces intense euphoria, although there are a whole host of very dangerous side effects as well. Uses of these different drugs can cause tolerance, addiction, and withdrawal. Tolerance is the decreased responsiveness to that drug over time, which requires further and further doses in order to achieve the same effect. It's what can contribute to dependence and addiction. Addiction is that chronic relapsing disorder that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite any of the harmful consequences. And withdrawal refers to the physical and psychological symptoms that occur when a person stops using that drug that they have become dependent on. So much of what we do and how we feel comes from neurotransmission and hormones. And the brain, of course, plays an important role on this as well. And so that part is up next. We'll learn all about the different parts of the brain and how they work together in order to allow us to understand the world around us. So thank you so much for watching. And as always, remember, be kind to your mind.